Malik walked into the high-end clothing store, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, elegant space. The smell of polished wood and expensive fabric filled the air, and the soft lighting highlighted the neatly arranged suits on display. Malik was used to places like this. He had worked hard to get where he was, and now he was a successful businessman, respected in the city for his achievements. But there was more to Malik than met the eye. He was also the leader of the most powerful gang in the city, though most people didn't know that. Today, he was here for a suit. He had an important meeting scheduled for the evening, and he needed something that would help him make an impression. As he walked past the rows of suits, Malik felt a sense of calm. He knew what he wanted, but what he didn't expect was what happened next. David, a salesman in his mid-30s, approached Malik. David was new to the store, but he had been working in retail for years and prided himself on being able to tell who could afford what. When he saw Malik, his judgment was quick. Malik was dressed in a plain hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. David immediately thought that Malik was just another person who couldn't afford the fancy suits. He didn't know who Malik was or what he did, but he made an assumption based on his appearance. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" David asked in a dismissive tone, not bothering to hide his judgment. He didn't believe this man would be interested in the high-end suits on display. Malik paused for a moment, surprised by the tone in David's voice. He wasn't used to being treated like this. Most people in the store knew who he was, and they usually treated him with respect. But this salesman didn't know who he was, and that didn't sit well with Malik. "I'm looking for a suit," Malik replied calmly, trying to keep his cool. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also didn't appreciate the way David was speaking to him. David, still assuming that Malik couldn't afford anything, led him over to the less expensive section of the store. "We have some nice options here for someone with your style," David said, clearly trying to show Malik what he thought he could afford. Malik felt his patience starting to wear thin. He wasn't going to let this salesman get away with his assumptions, but he didn't want to make a scene either. He politely declined David's suggestions and turned to walk away, hoping to find something that suited him better. As he walked away, David, still irritated by what he thought was an ungrateful customer, muttered under his breath, "Don't come in here if you can't afford it." Malik, hearing this, stopped in his tracks. He turned slowly to face David, his expression serious. He had been patient, but now his temper was rising. "Excuse me," Malik said, his voice low but steady. David, not realizing the danger he was in, looked back at him and shrugged. "Yeah, you heard me," David said with a smirk, his confidence growing as he thought Malik wouldn't dare cause trouble in such a fancy store. "Get out of here if you're just wasting our time." What happened next would change everything for David. He didn't know it yet, but Malik was not someone to be disrespected. The consequences of his actions would come soon enough, and David would learn that assumptions could be dangerous, especially when they were made about the wrong person. Malik stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. The nerve of this salesman. He had heard disrespect before, but this was something else. Malik had worked hard to get where he was, and the idea that someone could judge him based on how he looked made his blood boil. But Malik wasn't someone who lost his temper easily. He knew that sometimes it was better to keep calm and show restraint. He took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. David, on the other hand, didn't notice the tension in the air. His smug expression told Malik everything he needed to know. David still thought that Malik was just another man who didn't belong in a store like this. He crossed his arms and stared at Malik, ready to show him out. "You don't belong here, do you?" David said, clearly assuming he had won the situation. "You should leave before you cause a scene." Malik's mind raced. He wanted to teach David a lesson, but not in the way the salesman was probably expecting. Instead of raising his voice or reacting with anger, Malik decided to take a different approach. He was a man who valued his time and didn't want to waste it on petty arguments, but he also didn't want to let David's attitude slide. Malik smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You're right about one thing," he said slowly. I don't belong here. But it's not because of my clothes. It's because of people like you who think they can judge others without knowing anything about them." David blinked, a little taken aback by Malik's calm demeanor, but he wasn't about to back down. "Well, maybe you should learn to dress better if you want to be treated like you belong in a place like this." Malik's smile faded, and for a moment the room seemed to quiet down. The other customers had stopped talking, sensing the rising tension. Malik's voice was still steady, but it was laced with authority. "Let me tell you something, David," Malik said, his words clear and firm. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" David frowned, not understanding the shift in Malik's tone. "No, and I don't care to know," he replied with a dismissive shrug. That's when Malik decided it was time to reveal who he truly was. He didn't need to show off or make a scene, but he wanted to teach David that not everything in life could be judged on appearance. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, waiting for the call to connect. A moment later, a voice answered on the other end. "Malik, what's up?" It was one of his associates from the gang, someone he trusted. Malik spoke into the phone for a brief moment before hanging up. David watched, confused and still unaware of what was unfolding. "What's that supposed to be about?" he asked, his tone now more defensive. Malik took a step forward, looking directly at David, his eyes now filled with quiet authority. "The next time you think about disrespecting someone based on how they look, remember that appearances can be deceiving. You just slapped the wrong person today, David. And trust me, you'll learn who I am soon enough." David laughed nervously, unsure of whether Malik was just bluffing or if something else was happening. But Malik wasn't done. He wasn't interested in a fight, but he was ready to stand up for himself. Malik turned away and started walking toward the exit, but not before sending one last glance over his shoulder. "I'll be back," he said calmly, leaving the store without another word. The tension in the air was thick as Malik stepped outside. David stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Little did he know, Malik wasn't just a regular customer. He was the leader of one of the most powerful gangs in the city. David's behavior had just unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would soon come to haunt him. As Malik walked out of the store, he could feel the tension in the air, but he didn't let it get to him. He had done what he needed to do. He knew that confronting David might not be enough to teach him a real lesson, but he wasn't worried. Malik wasn't just a businessman. He had connections in places that most people didn't even know existed. The city was his domain, and it wasn't just the streets he ruled. It was the people who lived there. He got into his car and gave a quick instruction to his driver, telling him to head to the office. As they drove through the city, Malik's mind wandered. He had worked his whole life to get to this point. The wealth, the influence, the power, it had all come with years of sacrifice and determination. But the way people like David treated others, especially based on assumptions, was something Malik couldn't tolerate. David hadn't even taken a moment to understand who Malik was or where he came from. It was that kind of ignorance that had built walls between people and caused unnecessary problems. Back at the store, David was still standing in the same spot, unsure of what had just happened. He had been a bit too confident earlier, but now, as he thought about Malik's calm demeanor and the cryptic words he had left behind, a knot of worry started to form in his stomach. He didn't know what to expect next, but he had a bad feeling about it. David decided to call his manager. "Hey, you're not going to believe what just happened," he said. "Some guy just walked in, and I told him he didn't belong here. He seemed harmless, but now I don't know what I've done. He said he'd be back, and it didn't sound like a joke." The manager, who had heard similar stories about wealthy people and power struggles, was immediately concerned. "David, you need to be careful. You don't know who that guy is. He could be anyone. And if he said he'd be back, you better take it seriously." David tried to brush it off. "It's fine. I don't think he's anyone important. I'm sure he's just blowing off steam." But deep down, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been dismissive without knowing who Malik was. What if he was someone dangerous? What if Malik wasn't just a regular businessman, as he had assumed? That thought lingered in his mind as the minutes ticked by. Meanwhile, Malik arrived at his office. The building was one of the tallest in the city, and he held meetings there with some of the most influential figures in town. His associates were already waiting, and when Malik entered, they immediately knew something was different about the day. Without saying much, Malik explained briefly what had happened in the store. "There's a salesman at that high-end store who disrespected me. I need him to understand that no one should judge a book by its cover," Malik said. "I'll deal with this, but I need to make sure that David learns that lesson the hard way. We're not just dealing with him, we're sending a message." His right-hand man, Jordan, nodded. "We'll take care of it. Don't worry, Malik. We've got your back." Malik didn't have to say much more. He trusted his team, and they knew exactly how to handle situations like this. David's careless words had set a plan into motion. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. Something that was earned, not given out based on appearance or assumptions. Back at the store, David couldn't shake the feeling that he might have just crossed a line. He went about his work, but the thought of what Malik had said kept replaying in his mind. What if the man wasn't someone to take lightly? He had no idea that Malik was more than just a businessman. He was a man who commanded respect, and David was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next day, David couldn't get the conversation with Malik out of his head. Every time he walked past the suits in the store, he thought about the man's calm demeanor and the warning that had come with it. He kept trying to brush it off, telling himself that Malik was just another customer. But deep down, he knew that Malik wasn't just another regular shopper. There was something different about him. David tried to carry on with his day, helping other customers and organizing the store, but the nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He kept wondering if Malik would show up again, and if he did, what would happen? The man hadn't looked like a gangster, but what if he was? David had seen stories on the news about people who had connections in the underground world, people who seemed ordinary but were anything but. He didn't want to imagine the consequences of upsetting someone like that. Back at the office, Malik wasn't wasting any time. He had his associates gather information on David. The store where the incident had occurred wasn't too far from the neighborhood Malik often passed through. He didn't like to use his influence in public spaces, but he knew that David had crossed a line. He wasn't going to let his respect be taken lightly. Malik was used to being in control, and the disrespect from the salesman had ignited a desire to set things right. Malik wasn't just the leader of the most feared gang in the city. He also had deep ties to the city's business world. Many of his operations were hidden behind legal ventures, and his empire spanned across a vast network of people, some of whom were connected to luxury businesses like the one David worked in. It wasn't long before Malik's associates had gathered the information they needed about David, from his background to his job history. They even knew about his family and personal life, things that David never imagined someone like Malik could find out. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about understanding the person who had disrespected him. Malik knew that David wasn't the real issue. It was the kind of arrogance that many people in the city carried with them. People like David, who assumed they could treat others however they wanted, needed to be reminded of the consequences of their actions. The plan wasn't complicated. Malik wasn't interested in making a scene. He didn't need to make David's life miserable. He just wanted to make sure the salesman understood the value of respect. Later that afternoon, one of Malik's trusted associates, a man named Tony, visited the store under the guise of a wealthy businessman looking for a suit. He was instructed to talk to David and subtly remind him of the warning Malik had given him the previous day. As Tony entered the store, he could see David at the counter, still looking uneasy. Tony approached him, his smile friendly but firm. "You don't remember me, but I was here yesterday," Tony said, using his calm but confident voice. "I know you've had some issues with a customer, someone you didn't quite understand. but I think you might want to reconsider how you handle people like that in the future." David's eyes widened as he realized who Tony was referring to. He was starting to connect the dots. "I didn't mean any disrespect," David stammered, his face turning pale. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the point, isn't it?" Tony interrupted, his tone serious. "It's not about what someone looks like. It's about how you treat others. You can't judge people by their appearance. It's not just about business. It's about respect." David nodded slowly, clearly rattled by Tony's words. He had been given a clear message. He now knew that Malik wasn't someone he could afford to disrespect. The thought of crossing the wrong person had scared him more than anything else. As Tony left the store, David sat quietly behind the counter, reflecting on the events of the last 24 hours. He knew he had learned a hard lesson, one he wouldn't soon forget. The moment Malik had stepped into the store had changed everything for him. He realized now that there were people in this city who had power, influence, and connections far beyond what he could ever understand. And those were the people you never wanted to cross. The next few days were quiet in the store, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was still hanging in the air. He tried to go about his work, serving customers, arranging suits, and managing the day-to-day tasks. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about Malik and the encounter they had. The words Tony had spoken to him seemed to echo in his mind, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth was clear. He had messed up. David had been too quick to judge Malik, and now he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a serious mistake. He had no idea who the man was when he had first walked into the store, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he might have crossed a line that he couldn't come back from. He knew that he had to do something to make things right. Meanwhile, Malik wasn't dwelling on the past. He was busy with his own affairs, making moves in the city, and handling the work that came with running a successful business and a powerful gang. But there was something that had been bothering him since the incident in the store. It wasn't about David's rudeness. It was the reminder of how often people like David thought they could look down on others without ever knowing their story. Malik had always been a man of action, and while he wasn't the type to act impulsively, he had a way of making sure that people remembered their place. He didn't need to make a big scene. He wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. But Malik also knew the value of showing people that respect was something you earned, not something you took for granted. One afternoon, Malik decided it was time to pay a visit to the store himself. He had already made it clear that he didn't tolerate disrespect, but now he wanted to do something that would teach David the full extent of that lesson. Malik wasn't angry, but he wanted David to understand the difference between arrogance and humility. As he entered the store, the bell above the door rang softly, and the atmosphere seemed to shift. David was behind the counter, and when he saw Malik walk in, he froze. He could feel his heart race. Malik walked up to the counter slowly, his eyes meeting David's. The salesman's stomach tightened as he tried to steady himself. He was expecting the worst, but didn't know what to expect from Malik. Would he demand an apology? Would he do something worse? Malik smiled politely, his tone calm. "I wanted to stop by and speak with you, David. I think you and I need to have a proper conversation." David's hand shook slightly as he picked up a few suit jackets, not knowing what to do. "Yes, Mr. Malik. I owe you an apology," he stammered. "I didn't realize who you were when you came in. I was wrong to treat you that way." Malik nodded, appreciative of the apology, but not expecting much more. "It's not about you saying sorry, David. It's about you understanding that people are more than just what they appear to be. That's the lesson here." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was clear that Malik wasn't there to make trouble. "I understand, Mr. Malik. I really do. I made a mistake, and I will do better." Malik looked at him for a long moment, making sure David understood the gravity of the situation. Then, with a nod, he turned to leave. "Just remember, respect is the most important thing in this world. And once you lose it, it's not always easy to earn it back. But I'm giving you a chance. As Malik stepped out of the store, David stood there, his mind racing. He couldn't believe how close he had come to making a real mistake. He had learned the hard way that no one should ever be judged based on their appearance, and that respect wasn't something you should take lightly. For Malik, the lesson had been delivered. He knew that David wouldn't forget what had happened, and in the future, David would think twice before making assumptions about people. The power of respect and the lessons it carried had been taught, not with force, but with calm authority. Malik knew that he didn't need to shout or act out of anger. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons were the ones delivered quietly. Days passed after Malik's visit to the store, and the tension in David's mind slowly began to fade. But it wasn't over. He had learned his lesson, but a part of him couldn't help but feel uneasy. The way Malik had carried himself, calm yet powerful, had left a lasting impression on him. David couldn't stop thinking about how a simple interaction with a customer had turned into something so much bigger. He had been lucky Malik didn't escalate things further. It was a wake-up call, and David knew he couldn't afford to forget it. David's colleagues noticed that he had changed. Normally a confident, sometimes cocky, salesperson, he was now quieter and more reflective. When the store manager asked if he was doing okay, David simply nodded. "I learned something important recently," he said, though he didn't go into detail. He couldn't bring himself to tell them what had happened with Malik, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never treat another customer the way he had treated Malik. The embarrassment of not knowing who someone was, and the lessons he'd learned from Malik, were things David would carry with him forever. As for Malik, he didn't give the store or David another thought. He had made his point, and now his attention was back on the many other things that filled his life. Business was booming, and the influence he held in the city was growing. But deep down, Malik was satisfied with how everything had played out. He had reminded David of an important truth: respect doesn't come from status, appearance, or assumptions, but from the way you treat others. The incident with David had been a small chapter in Malik's life, but for David, it was a pivotal moment. Every day, he thought about the man who had taught him such a valuable lesson without raising his voice, without threats, just with calm words and a quiet presence. It made David reflect on his own life and how he treated others, particularly people who didn't fit the mold of what he thought was acceptable. His attitude began to shift. He started listening more to his customers, paying closer attention to their needs, and showing them respect, no matter how they looked. One afternoon, as David was working the store's front desk, a customer walked in who caught his attention. This time, David didn't judge based on looks. Instead of assuming anything, he smiled warmly and greeted the man. To David's surprise, the man was a famous local celebrity, known for his charitable work and high profile in the community. The man struck up a conversation with David, and after a few minutes, David realized that the man wasn't just a customer. He was someone whose presence had affected the lives of many. This encounter made David feel grateful. It was another reminder that respect and kindness went a long way. He had learned from the mistake he made with Malik, and it had made him more aware of how he interacted with the people around him. He knew that the world was full of people who had stories, struggles, and victories, just like him. The lesson Malik had taught him wasn't just about appearances. It was about giving everyone a fair chance, regardless of how they looked on the outside. David felt a sense of pride, knowing he had changed, and from that day on, he vowed to never again judge anyone by their cover. Meanwhile, Malik continued his life, focused on his work and the gang he ran. He knew that he had taught David a valuable lesson, but he didn't need thanks or recognition for it. For Malik, respect was earned, not demanded, and he was content knowing that his message had been received loud and clear. It wasn't the first time he'd taught someone such a lesson, but it was one he would always remember, not because of how dramatic it had been, but because of how subtle and powerful it had been. Weeks had passed since the incident in the store, and things had quieted down for both Malik and David. Malik had gone back to his regular life, filled with meetings, business ventures, and the responsibilities of running his empire. But the lessons from that day stuck with him. He knew that the power he held wasn't just in the businesses he ran, but in the way people respected him. That respect wasn't just about fear or money. It was about understanding one another and knowing that no one should be judged by their appearance. David, on the other hand, had completely changed. The lesson he had learned from Malik was still fresh in his mind. He thought about it every time he dealt with customers or even when he looked in the mirror. It wasn't just about how he treated others, but how he viewed himself and the world around him. He realized that his own arrogance and judgments had limited his understanding of people. Now he made a conscious effort to be kinder, to truly listen, and to see people for who they were, not just what they looked like. One afternoon, while David was working, a woman entered the store. She was a regular customer, someone he had helped before, but today she seemed different. She was wearing casual clothes, and David noticed she looked a little tired. Still, he didn't assume anything. He greeted her with his usual warm smile and asked if she needed assistance. The woman smiled back, but there was something in her eyes that made David pause. "I'm just browsing today," she said softly. "I'm actually looking for something special, but I'm not sure where to start." David, remembering the lessons he had learned, took the time to engage with her. He didn't rush or make assumptions. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions to understand what she was really looking for. As they talked, she opened up about her struggles and the challenges she was facing. She mentioned her recent health issues and how she had been balancing a job, her family, and personal care. David listened intently, offering advice on the best clothing for comfort and style, and even suggesting a few pieces that would suit her needs. As they continued talking, David realized how much he had learned from his experience with Malik. The woman wasn't just a customer. She was someone who had her own story, her own challenges. By truly listening to her, David was able to help her find the perfect outfit, not just for the occasion, but for her comfort and peace of mind. At the end of their conversation, the woman thanked him warmly, grateful not only for the assistance, but for the kindness he had shown. "Thank you for really listening to me," she said with a smile. "It's been a rough week, and I really appreciate your help." David watched her leave the store, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that the shift in his attitude had made a difference, not only in his work, but in the way he interacted with others. He had learned that treating people with respect, no matter their background or appearance, could create connections that went beyond simple transactions. Meanwhile, Malik's life continued as it always had, but he couldn't help but feel proud of the change he had inspired in David. It wasn't about making him afraid or humbling him publicly. It was about showing him the value of respect and the power of seeing people for who they really were. In the end, both men had learned something important. Respect isn't something that can be demanded. It has to be earned, and it begins with understanding and kindness. Malik didn't need an apology or recognition, but the knowledge that he had helped someone become a better person was enough. For David, the journey of learning and growth had only just begun, but he was finally on the right path. And both knew, in their own way, that this was a lesson that would last a lifetime.